There is a moment, somewhere deep in the lore of Warhammer 40,000, that stops almost every new reader cold. It happens when you first realize that the Space Marines you've been reading about, those impossibly powerful, 7-foot-tall, ceramic-armored warriors who can punch through tank plating and survive in the vacuum of space, are not the most powerful thing on the battlefield. Not even close. Space Marines are terrifying. They genuinely are. But when a Primarch steps onto that same battlefield, every Space Marine present becomes something closer to a supporting actor in someone else's story. The numbers stop making sense. The descriptions start reading like myths. A single being wades through entire legions the way a man walks through knee-high grass. And the more you dig into the actual lore, the more you start to wonder whether strong is even the right word anymore. So, just how strong are Primarchs in Warhammer 40,000? That's what we're going to spend today going through, carefully, thoroughly, and with all the atmospheric weight this subject deserves. Because the answer is not a simple number or a clean ranking. It's a question that touches on the nature of godhood, on the relationship between flesh and the warp, on what it means to be engineered to win wars that no ordinary being was ever supposed to survive. We're going to start at the foundation, what a Primarch actually is and how they came to exist, and we're going to work our way through every layer of their power, from the raw physical facts of their biology to the reality-bending upper limits of what the greatest among them can do. We'll spend time with the titans of raw physical strength, the supreme martial artists, the psychic demigods, and the ones who fell to chaos and became something that doesn't fit into any mortal frame of reference at all. By the end, you'll have a picture of Primarch power that is, I think, genuinely astonishing, not because of any single fact, but because of the cumulative weight of it all. So, settle in, close your eyes for just a moment, and picture a battlefield, the distant sound of artillery, the smell of burning ceramite, and somewhere in the smoke, something that is not quite human anymore is moving toward the front lines. Section 1. What is a Primarch, really? Before we talk about what Primarchs can do, we need to spend some real time on what they actually are. Because genetically engineered super soldier doesn't begin to cover it, and that framing actually undersells the horror and the wonder of them in equal measure. The Emperor of Mankind himself, one of the most powerful psychic entities to ever exist in human form, an immortal being who has lived for more than 40,000 years, decided at some point during the late 30th millennium that he needed generals, not lieutenants, not advisors, not even great warriors in the conventional sense. He needed something that had never existed before, something that could stand at the head of a 1,000,000-man army, inspire every soul around it to heights of impossible valor, master every form of warfare, from guerrilla skirmishing to void fleet battles, and then, when diplomacy failed and the enemy refused to submit, personally wade into the bloodiest fighting in the galaxy and come out the other side. And so began what the lore calls the Primarch Project. The exact science of how the Primarchs were made is deliberately kept obscure, even by Warhammer 40,000 standards, which is a setting that is already dense with technological mystery. What we do know is that the Emperor used his own genetic material as the base template. These were not random superhuman experiments. They were, in a very real sense, his children engineered from his own impossibly complex genome, then modified, enhanced, and specialized in ways that took centuries of effort from the finest scientific minds the Imperium possessed. But genetics alone does not explain what Primarchs are. The Emperor was also one of the greatest psychic entities in the material universe. When he created the Primarchs, he didn't just engineer their bodies. He wove something of the warp into their very existence. Every Primarch has a presence in the Imperium, the psychic dimension that underlies reality, that corresponds to their physical form. Their souls, if you want to use that word, burn like stars in the warp. Some of them, like Magnus the Red, are conscious of this and can use it deliberately. Others, like Angron, are defined by it in ways they never chose and never wanted. But all of them carry that dual nature, flesh and warp, matter and spirit, human and something that exceeds the definition of human in every direction. This is why Space Marines, who are themselves extraordinary beings, look at Primarchs the way ordinary humans look at Space Marines. The gap is not just quantitative, it's qualitative. A Space Marine is a human who has been elevated. A Primarch is something that began as human and was then remade into a category of its own. Consider what a standard Space Marine actually is. For context, an Astartes begins as a human youth, selected for exceptional physical and psychological resilience. Over a period of years, they receive 19 gene seed organ implants that fundamentally rebuild their body from the inside out. Their skeleton is reinforced until their bones are nearly as hard as ceramite armor plate. A second heart is grown. Their lungs expand to process toxic atmospheres. An organ called the oolitic kidney filters poisons from their bloodstream fast enough to render them effectively immune to most conventional toxins. The Becher's gland gives them the ability to produce a corrosive acid in their saliva, strong enough to burn through metal. Their muscles are augmented with synthetic fibers that multiply their strength several times over. Their blood clots in seconds. They can sleep with half their brain while the other half remains alert. They can eat almost anything organic for sustenance. A Finnish Space Marine is roughly 7 feet tall without armor. In full power armor, they can exert enough force to crush steel with their bare hands, sprint at speeds that would challenge a ground vehicle, and survive injuries that would be immediately fatal to any unaugmented human. They are, by any reasonable measure, transhuman, superhuman, beyond the limits of ordinary biology. A Primarch makes a Space Marine look like the ordinary human, not a little bit larger, not somewhat stronger. A Primarch occupies a different position in the hierarchy of power so completely that the gap between a Space Marine and a Primarch is, by some descriptions in the lore, comparable to the gap between an ordinary human and a Space Marine. Physically, Primarchs stand between 10 and 14 feet tall, though this varies considerably. Vulcan and Mortarion tend toward the larger end of that scale, while Alfarius and Omegon were reportedly closer to the stature of ordinary Astartes, which was part of their particular gift for deception. They are proportionally massive in ways that go beyond simple height. Their musculature is described in terms that approach the architectural. Their bones are denser than anything a Space Marine carries. Their reaction times operate on a scale that makes them genuinely difficult to track visually, even for other Astartes. Their senses, sight, hearing, smell, are so far beyond human that they can read the emotional state of a room from the scent of the air, identify individuals from hundreds of meters away by the sound of their heartbeat, and see in conditions that would be pitch darkness to anyone without augmentation. They also heal at a rate that borders on the ridiculous, not Vulcan's perpetual regeneration, which we'll talk about in detail later. Even ordinary Primarchs heal from injuries in hours or days that would take a Space Marine weeks and would be fatal to a human. Broken bones knit, muscle tears seal, internal organ damage repairs. During the Horus Heresy novels, there are Primarchs who fight through injuries, including fractured rib cages, caved-in abdominal walls, and partial skull fractures. Not because they're unaware of the damage, but because their body is handling it in the background while they continue fighting. And this is before we get to the psychic component, before we discuss what happens when a Primarch fully embraces their connection to the warp, before we talk about Chaos Ascension, or the particular gifts each Primarch carries that no other being in the galaxy possesses. The point is this: asking how strong are Primarchs is like asking how deep is the ocean. You can give an answer, but the answer keeps changing depending on which part of the ocean you're in, and some of it goes places where the instruments stop reading accurately. If you've made it this far, and you're enjoying this, drop a comment below, letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely love seeing where this reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. There is a lot more to cover. Section 2. The Biology of Godhood. How their bodies actually work. Let's slow down and really look at the physical mechanics of a Primarch, because this is where the numbers start to become genuinely staggering. We established that Space Marines receive 19 gene seed implants that reshape their body. Primarchs are not built on the same template. The Primarch project was a completely different undertaking. The Space Marine gene seed came later, derived from Primarch genetic material as a kind of mass production shortcut. Primarchs were the originals, the reference points, and the process that created them was so complex, so layered, so far beyond anything that was ever successfully replicated afterward, that even the Emperor could not fully explain it to anyone else. Each Primarch's body is, in a sense, a unique solution to the problem of creating the ultimate human warrior. They share certain baseline capabilities: the extreme strength, the durability, the accelerated healing, the dual hearts, the enhanced senses. But beyond that baseline, each one carries physical traits that no other Primarch possesses. Sanguinius had functional feathered wings capable of carrying his armored mass through the air at speeds that exceeded most aircraft. Vulcan's skin was described as volcanic, almost fireproof, in keeping with his connection to Nocturne's infernal environment. Leman Russ had canine teeth and an almost bestial set of instincts that went beyond anything explicable by genetics alone. Conrad Kurz's body ran cold, literally cold, as in measurably lower surface temperature than it should have been, and he had prophetic visions burned into his consciousness that had never left him since childhood. These individual traits are not cosmetic, they're functional. They represent the way the Emperor, or perhaps the Warp, or perhaps both together shaped each Primarch toward a specific archetypal role. Sanguinius's wings made him the supreme aerial combatant and gave him a presence on the battlefield that was literally impossible to ignore. Leman Russ's bestial edge made him the perfect hunter, the executioner, the one you sent when you needed something found and destroyed, and the method of destruction didn't matter. Kurz's cold prophetic clarity made him a creature of pure fear, operating in the dark spaces between certainty and terror. In terms of raw strength, the numbers that get thrown around in the lore are extraordinary. Primarchs in the novels have been described lifting and throwing objects that would challenge construction equipment. During the Great Crusade, there are accounts of Primarchs tearing open the hull plating of armored vehicles with their bare hands, not the augmented hands in power fists, but their actual unassisted physical hands. Angron, who sits at the extreme end of the physical power scale, reportedly broke the neck of an orc warboss the way you might snap a twig, and this was described as effortless. To put this in some kind of frame, a regular human with nothing special about them can exert perhaps half a ton of force under extreme effort. An enhanced athlete, a strong man at peak conditioning, might push toward a ton in specialized circumstances. A Space Marine and Astartes in full power armor, with all those gene seed upgrades running, can exert somewhere in the range of 5 to 10 tons of force in the lore, depending on the source and the context. This is why bolter rounds can punch through tank walls, and why a Space Marine can tear a vehicle door off its hinges without much visible effort. A Primarch's raw physical output makes a Space Marine look like that regular human by comparison. We're talking about beings who can, in the lore, lift objects in the range of hundreds of tons. The descriptions are vague by design, because Games Workshop has never tried to define these things with precise numbers, but the scale is clear from context. When Vulcan described repeatedly as the physically strongest of all Primarchs is shown fighting, the environment around him changes. The ground cracks, vehicles are thrown. Entire formations of enemy warriors are scattered like leaves in a storm. Their durability matches their strength in terrifying symmetry. A Primarch can take direct hits from weapons that would dismember or kill an ordinary Space Marine and continue fighting. Not just survive, continue fighting with purpose, with tactical awareness, with the full force of their capacity still engaged. During the Siege of Terra, in the Horus Heresy, Sanguinius fought Kabanda, a greater daemon of Khorne, one of the most powerful demonic entities in the setting, and though he was grievously injured, he broke the daemon's legs across his knee and cast it from the field through sheer force of will. A greater daemon, something that can tear through squads of Space Marines, the way a wolf moves through sheep. Their minds operate in ways that further amplify their physical capabilities. Primarchs don't freeze under pressure. They don't tire the way humans tire. They don't experience the cognitive collapse that comes with extreme stress and fatigue in the way that even Space Marines can. Their tactical processing runs so fast that they can manage multiple, simultaneous battlefields in their head, issuing precise orders for forces miles away while personally engaged in melee combat 5 feet in front of them. This isn't hyperbole. Multiple novels describe individual Primarchs doing exactly this. Their consciousness somehow split across the needs of the macro battle and the immediate demands of whatever enemy is trying to kill them at close range. There is also the matter of their charisma, which is a power of its own kind and shouldn't be underestimated. Every Primarch radiates something that the lore describes with words like presence or aura, a psychic weight to their existence that affects everyone around them. Ordinary humans in the presence of a Primarch often describe feeling an overwhelming compulsion to kneel, to defer, to follow. Even Space Marines, who are themselves conditioned beyond most forms of psychological pressure, feel the pull of their Primarch's presence as something close to a gravitational force. This is not metaphor. It's a genuine psychic effect rooted in their warp-touched nature, and it's part of why Primarchs were so effective as generals. You don't just follow them because they're right. You follow them because something deep in your biology recognizes that you are in the presence of something above you in the hierarchy of existence. The creation process itself left each of them with one other piece of equipment that no Space Marine or Custodian or Inquisitor or any other warrior in the Imperium possesses: a direct, immediate connection to their own warp soul. Most beings in the 40K universe interact with the warp accidentally, incidentally, or through intensive psychic training. Primarchs were made with that connection built in from the beginning. Even the ones who weren't formally classified as psychers, Leman Russ, Angron in his mortal form, Rogel Dorn carried warp-adjacent abilities that manifested in their personality, their instincts, their inexplicable luck in battle. The ones who were psychers, like Magnus, Lorgar, or Sanguinius to a lesser degree, had access to something that goes well beyond anything. The word psycher is usually used to describe. This dual nature, physical and warp, biological and metaphysical, is what ultimately defines the ceiling of Primarch power. The body alone would be extraordinary. The warp soul alone would be extraordinary. Together, they produce something that the setting itself has difficulty categorizing. Not human, not daemon, not machine, something altogether new. Section 3. The Hierarchy of Strength. Primarchs versus everything else. Before we get into the individual Primarchs and what each of them can do, it's worth establishing the power ladder clearly. Warhammer 40,000 has an enormous cast of powerful beings, and understanding where Primarchs sit in that hierarchy tells you something important. At the base of the warrior hierarchy, you have ordinary humans, the soldiers of the Astra Militarum, the bulk of humanity's fighting force. Individually, they're nothing special. They can be killed by almost anything the galaxy throws at them, and they die in enormous numbers constantly. The 40K universe chews through human lives the way a furnace chews through fuel. These are the people standing at the very bottom of the power scale. Above them, you have the Ogrins, a genetically distinct subspecies of humanity, bred for extreme environments, larger and physically stronger than baseline humans, but not particularly intelligent. An Ogrin is something like a wall with arms, formidable by human standards, nothing special in the context of 40K's bigger threats. Then you have regular guardsmen with special training, officers with decades of combat experience, the kind of veterans who've survived long enough to become genuinely dangerous by ordinary standards. Above all of that, Space Marines. We've already established what they are: the superhuman elite, 19 gene seed organs, power armor, 2 hearts and bones like reinforced ceramite. A regular Space Marine is more dangerous than anything that came before on that list, by a margin that is essentially insurmountable without specialized equipment or numbers. Above Space Marines, Custodians. The Emperor's personal guard, the Adeptus Custodes, are to Space Marines roughly what Space Marines are to unaugmented humans. Each one is individually crafted rather than produced from a template. Each one is rebuilt from infancy at the cellular level through a process so intensive that it produces only a tiny number of warriors compared to the Astartes. A Custodian is faster than a Space Marine, stronger, more durable, possessed of superior equipment, and trained in a combat methodology that is specifically designed to fight and kill threats that Space Marines cannot handle. One Custodian against one Space Marine is, in most lore contexts, not a close fight. And then, above Custodians, Primarchs. The gap between a Custodian and a Primarch is very clearly established in the lore. It's not as large as some of the other gaps on this list. A sufficiently coordinated group of Custodians with the right preparation can theoretically engage a Primarch And some sources suggest that 3 to 5 custodians working together might be a genuine challenge for some Primarchs in specific circumstances, but in a direct single combat scenario, most Primarchs would defeat even the greatest custodians. The lore describes this gap in several ways. One particularly useful framing comes from how various characters in the Horus Heresy novels react when they see a Primarch fight for the first time. Even custodians, beings who exist beyond the reach of most warriors, describe the experience of watching a Primarch in battle as something closer to watching a force of nature than watching a combatant. There's a qualitative difference in how they move, how they process the battlefield, how completely they dominate the space around them. Constantin Valdor, the Captain General of the Custodes, and perhaps the finest individual warrior the Custodians have ever produced, is one of the few non-Primarch beings described as capable of fighting Horus Lupercal to any meaningful degree. And this is held up as an extraordinary achievement, not because Valdor wins, but because the fact that he lasted against Horus at all is treated as a testament to just how exceptional even Valdor's abilities are. Above Primarchs, things get murky in ways that are deliberate. The Emperor himself is on another level, entirely the most powerful psychic entity in human history, a being whose presence in the warp is so immense that even the Chaos Gods take him seriously as a threat. But the Emperor is effectively a floor unto himself, not really part of the power-scaling discussion in a practical sense. The Chaos Gods, and their most powerful daemons, occupy a similar upper tier. The 4 great powers, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, Slaanesh, exist as metaphysical forces so vast that even the most powerful Primarchs are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively modest compared to the entities they serve. A single Chaos God could, if they focus their full attention on the material universe, rewrite the laws of physics across entire star systems. This is not something a Primarch can do. But between a Primarch at peak power and a mid-tier daemon, that's actually a fair fight, and frequently, the Primarch wins. The Cetan, the ancient star gods of the Necron race, beings who fed on the life energy of suns, are another category that exceeds Primarch power entirely. Though these entities have been shattered into fragments called shards and no longer operate at their original capacity. So what does this all add up to? It means that Primarchs occupy a very specific and important tier in the 40K power structure. They're below the truly cosmic entities, the Chaos Gods, the intact Cetan, the Emperor, but they are so far above everything else in the setting that for most practical purposes, they represent the ceiling of what a mortal origin being can do. They are the most powerful warriors in the history of humanity. In most circumstances, in most encounters, there is nothing that can reliably stop them that isn't itself on a similar level of power. This is the baseline against which everything else in this video needs to be understood. When we say a particular Primarch is the strongest, we mean strongest among beings who are already beyond almost every other category of existence in the setting. Section 4. The physical titans Vulcan, Angron, and Ferrus Manus. Within the already extraordinary range of Primarch capability, there is a subset who are distinguished specifically by raw, almost mechanical physical power. These are the beings for whom strong isn't even a useful word. Beings who are described in terms that make the structural engineers in the audience uncomfortable. Let's start with the one the lore most consistently names as the single, physically strongest Primarch, Vulcan of the Salamanders. Vulcan's homeworld was Nocturne, a volcanic death world of catastrophic geological instability, where the ground itself was an active threat, where the air near volcanic zones was hot enough to be a serious hazard, and where the indigenous wildlife was correspondingly hostile in ways that make most lethal environments in the 40K setting look welcoming. He grew up in this environment not as a protected genetic experiment being monitored by scientists, but as a survivor. He was thrown to Nocturne's surface as an infant when the Chaos Gods scattered all 20 Primarchs across the galaxy, and he lived. By the time his legion found him, Vulcan had already become a legend on Nocturne. He had been fighting and winning against the most dangerous creatures on the planet for years. He had earned the respect of the local population through sheer demonstrated competence, the kind of competence that required not just strength, but judgment, endurance, and an understanding of the natural world that he had developed entirely through necessity. His physical power is described in the novels as something that exceeds even the already staggering Primarch baseline. He is consistently ranked as the strongest of all 20 Primarchs in terms of raw physical output. The descriptions of him in combat are geological in their scale. He doesn't just hit enemies, he reshapes the area around them. During the dropsite massacre of Istvan V, in the chaos and horror of that devastating ambush, Vulcan reportedly tore through Iron Warrior's heavy fortifications with his bare hands. Not with siege weapons or specialized equipment, with his hands. He survived a low-yield tactical nuclear detonation at point-blank range. Let that settle for a moment. A nuclear weapon, close enough that the blast radius should have been lethal many times over. Vulcan survived it. His body healed, he continued. But Vulcan's most extraordinary physical attribute isn't even his strength or his near-indestructible durability in battle. It's his nature as a perpetual. A perpetual, in Warhammer 40,000 lore, is a human or human-derived being who cannot die, not very hard to kill, not regenerates from most injuries, cannot die. Their cellular regeneration is so complete and so fundamental to their existence that no matter what happens to their body, up to and including total cellular annihilation, they return, they wake up, they heal. They continue existing. Vulcan is the only Primarch confirmed to be a perpetual. This is an inheritance from the Emperor himself, who shares this property. And for Vulcan, the horror and the wonder of it played out in real time during the Horus Heresy. Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, Primarch of the Night Lords, took Vulcan prisoner after the Dropsite massacre and spent months trying to kill him. Not as a war objective, as an experiment, as a personal obsession. He beheaded Vulcan. He stabbed him through the heart with improvised cutting tools. He ripped out his throat. He threw him out of airlocks into the vacuum of space. He exposed him to conditions that would have destroyed any material object. Each time, Vulcan regenerated. Each time, Vulcan woke up. The Night Haunter eventually realized he could not kill Vulcan and turned to other methods. But the point stands. Vulcan survived everything the most creative and sadistic of his brothers could devise, and he did it through the sheer biological fact of what he is. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, occupies a different but equally impressive space on the physical power scale. Where Vulcan's power is rooted in raw organic output, Ferrus represents the merging of flesh and machine taken to a Primarch scale. His arms, both of them, were encased in living metal, a material with properties that defied ordinary metallurgy. These weren't prosthetics or augments. They were part of him, grown from his body, as much flesh as the rest of him was. The living metal gave his arms a strength and durability that exceeded even his Primarch baseline. He could work with metals and materials that no ordinary forge master could touch, shaping them with his hands in ways that required no tools. The weapons and armor he created personally during the Great Crusade were considered some of the finest in the Imperium. In pure physical terms, Ferrus Manus is frequently cited as one of the top 2 or 3 Primarchs in raw strength. The combination of his already extraordinary Primarch physiology with the metallic enhancement of his arms produced something that could compete with Vulcan for the title of strongest, depending on the source. His forging abilities alone, the ability to work metal with his bare hands at temperatures that would incinerate anything living, are a testament to what his body could withstand and output. His death at the hands of Fulgrim during the Dropsite massacre of Istvan V remains one of the most devastating moments in Horus Heresy lore, partly because of who died and how, but also because Ferrus Manus was one of the physically most formidable beings in the galaxy at the time of his death. Fulgrim defeated him, but not without demonic assistance that pushed Fulgrim beyond his normal limits. The point isn't that Ferrus was weak. The point is that the forces arrayed against him were extraordinary by any measure. And then there's Angron. Angron is, in some ways, the most tragic figure in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, because his story is inseparable from the butcher's nails, the cortical implants that were surgically embedded in his skull before the Emperor found him. These devices, a crude and brutal technology from the slave-fighting culture of New Syria, amplified aggression and made the pain of battle into something that felt like relief. They turned Angron into the most feared gladiator on his world, but they were also slowly killing him, destroying his capacity for higher thought, eroding his humanity milligram by milligram, year by year. The Emperor found Angron on the verge of his last stand, alongside a group of fellow slave warriors who were all about to die against a superior force. He teleported Angron away to safety, and Angron never forgave him for it, because the Emperor took him from the only death that would have meant anything to him, dying alongside his friends. As a mortal Primarch, Angron was described alongside Leman Russ and Vulcan as one of the most physically powerful beings in existence. His fighting style was pure aggression, total commitment, the embodiment of unstoppable forward momentum. He had no defensive technique worth speaking of. He just came at you, and he kept coming, and whatever you hit him with, he hit you back harder. The Butcher's nails made pain meaningless to him and turned battlefield damage into fuel rather than impediment. Wounds that would slow a Space Marine, or even another Primarch, barely registered to Angron because his neurological response to pain was so thoroughly overridden. In single combat, Angron was terrifying in ways that went beyond physical power. Leman Russ fought him and described it as the closest he had ever come to death. The experience of fighting Angron was described by multiple sources as something closer to being caught in a natural disaster than facing a warrior with strategy and intent. When Angron was elevated to a Daemon Prince of Khorne the Blood God, the Lord of Violence and martial power during the Horus Heresy, his already overwhelming physical capabilities were amplified beyond any mortal frame of reference. He grew. He became something enormous, winged, burning with cornate fire, a being whose mere presence on a battlefield caused mass psychological collapse among unprepared troops. He led 50,000 berserkers on a rampage through Imperial space during the 38th millennium that lasted over 2 centuries, and he has been repelled from the material universe multiple times only because banishing a Daemon Prince is possible in ways that simply killing one is not. Which brings us to an important distinction that we'll explore in more detail later. What it means when a Primarch falls to chaos, and how that changes the power ceiling entirely. Section 5. The Supreme Warriors Sanguinius, Lionel Johnson, and Leman Russ. There is a difference between strength and skill that the Primarch hierarchy illustrates very clearly. Vulcan and Angron represent the upper end of raw physical output. But if you were ranking Primarchs by their capability as warriors, their ability to fight, to win, to impose their will through the art of combat, specifically the conversation shifts to a different group of names. The 3 who appear most consistently at the top of the best fighter discussions in the lore are Sanguinius, Lionel Johnson, and Leman Russ. These are not necessarily the physically strongest Primarchs, but they are, by most accounts, the most dangerous in a direct fight. And the reasons why tell you something important about what dangerous really means at this level. Sanguinius, the Great Angel, Primarch of the Blood Angels, is the one most often named when lore scholars and fans debate who would win in an unconstrained one-on-one fight against any other Primarch. This is a controversial claim in the fan community, and I'll acknowledge that immediately, but it's also a claim with significant textual support. First, his physical gifts. Sanguinius was the only Primarch who could fly. His wings, enormous, feathered, and functional, were not just cosmetic. They gave him a genuine 3-dimensional combat advantage that no other Primarch could replicate without jump pack equipment, and even then, no jump pack gives you the maneuverability of actual wings integrated into your body. He could attack from angles that were functionally impossible to defend against, could reposition faster than any ground-bound warrior, could carry his armored mass through aerial combat with a grace that contrasted almost perversely with the violence of what he was doing. Second, his speed. Among the Primarchs, Sanguinius is consistently described as one of the fastest, possibly the fastest. There's a moment in the lore where a Blood Angel, carrying only a fraction of Sanguinius's psychic gift and genetic inheritance, perceived plasma bolts and laser fire as effectively stationary relative to his own movement speed. Sanguinius was the source of that gift. The implication for what Sanguinius's own perception and movement speed looked like is considerable. Third, his psychic foresight. Sanguinius had prophetic abilities, not the structured, deliberate psychic power of Magnus, but a war sense, an intuition about the immediate future that manifested in combat as the ability to predict incoming strikes before they landed. He could see what was about to happen fractions of a second before it did, which at the speed Primarchs operate is an enormous advantage. Fourth, his combat record. Sanguinius faced Kabanda, one of the most powerful greater daemons of Khorne, a being of terrifying martial capability, twice during the Horus Heresy. Both times, he won. The second time, he broke the daemon's legs across his knee and threw it out of the warp battle they were fighting in. Even then, gravely injured, he continued. On the eve of his death, he chose to stand against Horus Lupercal, the War Master, blessed by all four Chaos Gods, arguably the most powerful being in the material universe at that moment, short of the Emperor himself. Horus had already demonstrably killed or repelled every other Primarch who had tried to fight him since his fall. Sanguinius faced him, fought him, and while Horus ultimately prevailed, the price Sanguinius extracted was immense. He cracked Horus's armor, the supernatural, chaos-enhanced armor of the War Master, in a way that no other being had managed. And that crack, that wound Sanguinius forced open even in death, became the vulnerability the Emperor exploited to end Horus moments later. Sanguinius died knowing he would die. His prophetic gifts had shown him his own death long before the Siege of Terra. He went anyway, because sacrifice, he had decided, was the point. He could have stepped aside. He chose not to. The tragedy of it is inseparable from the assessment of his power, because what the lore is actually saying is that one of the greatest warriors who ever lived chose to fight a battle he knew he couldn't survive, and even in losing, he changed the outcome of everything. Lion L. Johnson, the first of the Primarchs, the Lord of the Dark Angels, is positioned slightly differently in the combat hierarchy, where Sanguinius's brilliance was expressed through speed, grace, and prophetic sense. The Lion's was expressed through pure martial mastery swordsmanship, at a level that the lore treats as essentially without peer. His upbringing on Caliban, another death world, this one, covered in ancient forests, haunted by chaos-twisted great beasts, produced in him a patience and precision that didn't come naturally to many of his brothers. He learned to hunt things that were much larger and more dangerous than him by being smarter, quieter, and more controlled than the prey. He learned to read the environment and the enemy simultaneously. He learned that victory wasn't always about who hit hardest, sometimes it was about who hit last. The Lion's sword work is described in terms that approach the impossible, even by Primarch standards. During the Great Crusade, he defeated every opponent who challenged him in single combat, including an hour-long duel with the champion of his own legion's council, a warrior selected specifically for the role without taking a single meaningful wound. The key detail in that account is the duration, an hour. At Primarch speeds, a sustained duel of that length is essentially a continuous series of thousands of individual exchanges, each one requiring perfect technical execution. His fight with Leman Russ, one of the most hotly debated single combats in all of Horus Heresy lore, ended without a winner because the two brothers were interrupted before a conclusion could be reached. But accounts of the fight suggest that neither could clearly establish dominance, which is significant given that Russ is himself one of the finest warriors in the setting. The Lion fought Leman Russ to a standstill, and this after years of campaigning, without either side gaining a decisive edge. In the current 41st millennium, the Lion has returned awakened from a sleep that lasted 10,000 years within the mysterious depths of the Dark Angel's mobile fortress monastery, known as the Rock. He emerged carrying weapons gifted by the Emperor himself, a radiant sword called Fealty and the Emperor's shield, and he has gone immediately to work against the forces threatening the Imperium. His confrontation with Angron in the Arcs of Omen campaign is one of the most dramatic story developments in recent 40K narrative, and the fact that the Lion returned, not fully recovered, still shaking off 10 millennia of slumber, was in any position to challenge a fully ascended daemon. Prince of Khorne tells you something about the absolute floor of what a Primarch represents, even at less than full capacity. Leman Russ, the Wolf King, the Emperor's executioner, occupies a position in the combat hierarchy that is, in some ways, the clearest of all three. He was the Primarch that the Emperor chose to send when something needed to be destroyed, and the method of destruction was not a concern. He was the hunting dog of the Imperium. If hunting dog is a term you can apply to something that can engage a Primarch in single combat and make it competitive, his fight against Magnus the Red at the burning of Prospero represents one of the most consequential single combats in Horus Heresy history. Magnus, the most powerful psyker among the Primarchs, a being whose psychic abilities bent and broke the laws of physics, faced Russ and was defeated. Not psychically, Russ has limited psychic capacity compared to Magnus, but in physical combat, where Russ's savage efficiency and his beast warrior instincts outpaced Magnus's academic power. Lemon Russ broke Magnus's back across his knee. This is a crucial piece of evidence in the debate about physical versus psychic power among the Primarchs. Raw martial ability, in the right circumstances, can overcome psychic superiority. The fight at Prospero was not a fair exchange of each combatant's best capabilities. Magnus had already refused to fight back for most of the battle, out of guilt and resignation. But the outcome still demonstrates something important about what Russ was capable of. Russ also fought Horus. He wounded the War Master, actually drove the spear of Russ into Horus's side, which is something almost no being in the material universe had managed against the chaos-empowered War Master before being overcome. The fact that he got that wound in at all is treated in the lore as an extraordinary achievement, and the wound had an unexpected effect. The power of the spear, which was effectively an instrument of the Emperor's will, temporarily cleansed Horus of his chaos corruption, and for just a moment, Russ saw his brother again, instead of the monster wearing his face. Russ hesitated, and in that hesitation, Horus recovered and repelled him. That hesitation, that moment of human feeling breaking through the warrior's discipline, is its own kind of statement about these beings. They are weapons beyond ordinary comprehension, but they are also, somehow, still people. Section 6. The War Master Horus and what Chaos Empowerment actually does. Let's talk about Horus Lupercal. Because in any honest assessment of Primarch strength, Horus, during the Horus Heresy, represents the absolute ceiling of what a Primarch has demonstrably been in the lore, and understanding him requires understanding what it means when a Primarch is blessed by the Chaos Gods. Before his fall, Horus was widely regarded as the finest of all the Primarchs. Not necessarily the strongest physically, that distinction, as we discussed, generally goes to Vulcan. Not the greatest psychic, that's Magnus, and it's not even close. But in terms of the total package, martial ability, tactical genius, charisma, leadership, the ability to make every single person who interacted with him feel as though they were individually important to him, Horus was the complete article. The Emperor named him War Master of all the legions, for reasons that were about more than politics. Horus was genuinely the most capable of all his sons at the totality of what a Primarch was supposed to be. His physical capabilities before the fall were already extraordinary, even by Primarch standards. Multiple accounts describe him as one of the finest hand-to-hand combatants among his brothers, not universally agreed upon as the best, but consistently placed in the top tier alongside the Lion and Sanguinius. His weapons, the Worldbreaker Mace and the Talon of Horus, a lightning claw of supreme craftsmanship, were instruments designed for someone who could already do massive amounts of damage unaided, and they amplified that capability into something that reshaped terrain. And then he was brought to Davin, and the Chaos Gods got to him, and everything changed. The nature of Horus's corruption is one of the most carefully constructed pieces of lore in the Horus Heresy saga. He wasn't simply corrupted. The four Chaos Gods collectively worked on him over a period of time, using the wound he sustained on Davin as the opening, layering power and madness and revelation in ways that were specifically designed to turn the Emperor's favorite son into the perfect weapon against him. All four gods contributed. Khorne gave him martial power beyond his natural limits. Tse-Anch gave him a calculating brilliance that went beyond even his original genius. Nurgle made him resilient in ways that exceeded ordinary Primarch durability. Slaanesh made him more seductive, more charismatic, more compelling than he had ever been. The result was something that the lore describes as being near godlike in the material universe. In the accounts of the final battle aboard his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, the chaos-empowered Horus is depicted as an entity that had effectively merged with the warp around him. He didn't just carry the blessings of four gods, he had become, in some sense, a conduit for all of them simultaneously. His form was shifting and monstrous. His presence was described as causing reality to crack and bow around him. The void around his ship was heavy with psychic pressure, so much so that it affected the physical structure of the vessel itself. He killed Sanguinius, one of the finest warriors of the age, a being who could crack chaos-enhanced armor with his bare hands, died fighting Horus. Not quickly, Sanguinius fought long and hard, and exacted that costly wound in the process, but Horus won. And then the Emperor came. The fight between the Emperor and Horus is deliberately kept somewhat obscure in the lore, because Games Workshop has always been careful not to over-define what the Emperor's full capabilities are. But what we know is this. When the Emperor arrived, he was fighting defensively against Horus for an extended period. The Emperor, who is described elsewhere as so far above the Primarchs that comparison is almost meaningless, was being driven back by a chaos-empowered Horus. He was wounded, he nearly lost. He was ultimately saved by the sacrifice of Elanius Pius, a single mortal man who stepped in front of Horus to protect the Emperor, and was destroyed instantly. But that act of pure human courage reached through the warp corruption around Horus and reminded him, for just a fragment of a second, that he had once been something other than a weapon of chaos. And in that fraction of a second, the Emperor struck with everything he had. Horus died, and the Emperor, so grievously wounded that he could no longer maintain physical form, was interred on the Golden Throne, where he has been for 10,000 years since. The takeaway from all of this is not that Horus was stronger than the Emperor. It's that chaos empowerment at its maximum expression, when all four gods back a single champion to this degree, produces something that even the Emperor of mankind struggled to overcome. And that Horus was the template, the finest mortal Primarch as the base, then raised to a level that the material universe was not really designed to accommodate. This sets a benchmark. The chaos-empowered Horus at the Siege of Terra represents, as far as the lore is concerned, the highest a Primarch has demonstrably been pushed in terms of raw power. Everything else, every comparison and analysis we do, takes place somewhere below that ceiling. Section 7. The Psychic God Magnus the Red. If the previous sections have been about warriors, about beings who fight with weapons and strength and martial discipline, this section is about something categorically different. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, is not just a fighter who also has psychic powers. He is, in his deepest nature, a psychic entity who also happens to be capable of physical combat. The distinction matters enormously because it means that the question of how strong is Magnus has two completely different answers depending on which dimension of his existence you're measuring. His physical capabilities as a Primarch are real. He is large, strong, durable, and possessed of the standard suite of Primarch combat ability. He is not the weakest fighter among his brothers. But in direct physical confrontation, as the battle with Leman Russ on Prospero demonstrated, his physical capability alone is not at the absolute top of the Primarch scale. When Russ caught him in a position where Magnus had chosen not to fight back out of guilt and resignation, Russ's physical dominance over the Crimson King was clear. But Magnus operating at full psychic capacity is a different conversation entirely. Magnus was aware, conscious, and processing sensory information from before his birth. His gestation pod, scattered by the Chaos Gods during the Primarch scattering, somehow remained connected to his developing consciousness throughout the journey, and he remembers the experience. He arrived on Prospero, already more psychically aware than most advanced psychers achieve through lifetimes of training. On Prospero, he found a world of psychers, a genuinely rare and valuable exception in the Imperium, a planet where psychic talent was relatively common, and where a culture of careful psychic practice had developed. He outclassed everyone there within years. Not just outclassed, surpassed them so completely that describing the gap requires metaphor rather than measurement. Magnus's psychic power allowed him to do things that the lore has difficulty categorizing within its own framework. He could perceive across time, seeing the past and the possible future as a kind of perpetual awareness rather than a focused act of divination. He could communicate across interstellar distances without a Geller field or an astropathic relay. He could see into the warp directly, not as a dangerous act of sorcery requiring preparation and protection, but as a natural mode of perception, the way a human being looks around a room. His most dramatic pre-heresy feat is the one that set the Horus heresy in motion. His psychic warning to the Emperor about Horus's corruption. Magnus sent this message by literally forcing his way through the wards the Emperor had placed around Terra, psychic defenses that had been constructed by the most powerful psyker in human history, designed specifically to be impenetrable. Magnus broke through them. He sent his message, and in doing so, he accidentally destroyed everything the Emperor had been building in the webway beneath the palace, because the force required to punch through those defenses shattered the psychic containment that was holding the webway project together. The Emperor's response was to send Lemon Russ to bring Magnus to Terra in chains, which, given what we've just described Magnus doing, is its own statement about what a Primarch represents. The response to a being who broke through the psychic defenses of Terra with a message was to send another Primarch. As a daemon prince of Tzeentch in the current millennium, Magnus the Red operates at a level that is genuinely difficult to assess against his mortal form. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, the lord of change, the chaos god of psychic power, mutation, and scheming, is Magnus's patron, and the bond between them is described as something closer to a merger than a mere patron-champion relationship. Magnus, on his planet of the sorcerers, deep in the Eye of Terror, is a being who has access to Tzeentch's vast pool of knowledge and can perceive events across both the material universe and the warp simultaneously. His psychic output in this form is not measurable against his mortal capabilities. It is simply a different category. He has invaded Terra itself in the 41st millennium, breaching the sanctum of the Astronomicon during the War of the Beast, assaulting it again, more recently demonstrating that even 10,000 years of demonic ascension has not diminished his ambitions, or, arguably, his capabilities relative to what he was before. The most profound statement the lore makes about Magnus is not about what he can do, it's about what he chose to do, repeatedly, and with full foreknowledge of the consequences. Magnus saw the future clearly enough to know that his warning to the Emperor would be interpreted as treachery. He sent it anyway, because Horus's corruption was a greater threat than his own downfall. He saw that his sons would be destroyed. He chose to sacrifice them, rather than let his guilt about Prospero be used to manipulate him further. And he was wrong about some of it, and right about some of it, and in the end, Tzeentch had been steering the entire sequence of events the whole time, using Magnus as a game piece in a scheme that stretched across millennia. The god of change, with near-infinite patience and incomprehensibly complex planning, chose Magnus as his champion. That alone tells you something about what Magnus represents in terms of potential. Section 8. The returned Primarchs, Guilliman and the Lion, in the 41st millennium. One of the most significant developments in recent Warhammer 40,000 narrative has been the return of two Primarchs to active service in the 41st millennium Robout, Guilliman, and Lion L. Johnson, and what their presence means for the ongoing story of the Imperium. These two cases are interesting not just from a narrative standpoint, but from a power standpoint, because they give us a rare opportunity to see how Primarchs interact with the modern setting, a galaxy that has changed enormously in the 10,000 years since the Horus heresy. Robout Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, was the first to return, and his return was one of the most consequential events in 40K history since the Horus heresy itself. He had spent almost 10,000 years in a stasis field, aboard a device called the Capsule of the Ultramarines, technically alive, but effectively suspended between life and death, kept from dying by the same technology that prevented him from healing. He had been stabbed by Fulgrim, his own brother, now a daemon prince, at the end of the heresy, and the wound was poisoned with chaos-touched venom that the Imperium's finest medicaes could neither treat nor cure. His resurrection in the closing years of the 41st millennium required a combination of the most advanced Mechanicus medical technology and direct psychic intervention by Yenid, the Eldar god of the dead, through the agent of the Visarch. Both together were barely enough. Guilliman woke up to a galaxy that horrified him. The Imperium he had helped build, which he had designed after the heresy, with careful, rational principles meant to ensure its long-term stability and effectiveness, had become something almost unrecognizable. Superstition had replaced reason. Bureaucratic corruption had hollowed out the institutions he had built. The Ministorum, the religious organization worshipping the Emperor as a god, something Guilliman had explicitly not wanted, had become one of the most powerful forces in human space. The Codex Astartes, his tactical guide for the Space Marine chapters, had been interpreted so rigidly that its practical intent had been lost. He was appalled, and that appalling was itself a kind of statement about who he was. Guilliman was not the greatest fighter among the Primarchs. He would be the first to admit that several of his brothers exceeded him in pure martial capability. But he was perhaps the greatest strategist, the finest administrator, the one who most clearly understood that an Imperium worth fighting for had to be built and maintained, as well as defended. His immediate response on returning was to take command of the Indomitus Crusade and begin, systematically, to try to hold the galaxy together. In battle, the returned Guilliman is formidable by any standard below Primarch level. He carries the armor of fate rebuilt by Belisarius Cawl, using 10,000 years of technological development and the Emperor's sword, a weapon of immense power. His presence in the current narrative is that of a military commander who fights at the front of his forces rather than from behind them, partly out of genuine martial ability, and partly because having a Primarch visible in the fight changes what those around him are capable of. He has fought Chaos Daemon Primarchs in the current narrative and survived. He is not necessarily winning those fights decisively. Daemon Primarchs are among the most powerful beings in the setting, but his survival and continued effectiveness in those encounters is itself a demonstration of what he represents. Lionel Johnson's return is more recent, and in some ways more dramatically striking. The Lion had been asleep in the deepest chambers of the rock for 10,000 years, not dead, not in stasis the way Guilliman was, but in some kind of healing sleep that the Watchers in the Dark had been maintaining, waiting for the right moment. He woke into the middle of the catastrophic series of events that included Vashtor's assault on the rock and the return of various traitor forces to prominence in Imperium space. The Lion's first acts upon waking were characteristic. He didn't stop to be briefed. He didn't take time to acclimate. He assessed the situation as best he could, with the information immediately available, and moved to address the most pressing threat. This is very on-brand for a being who spent years as a child surviving alone in monster-haunted forests with no one to teach him anything. He doesn't need orientation. He reads the environment and acts. His engagement with Angron, the Daemon Prince of Khorne, the most physically powerful being among the fallen Primarchs, is one of the most discussed recent developments in 40K narrative. The Lion fought Angron, banished him from the field, and pushed back the threat that Angron represented to an entire planet. This matters because Angron, as a Daemon Prince, is not the same entity as Angron the mortal Primarch. He is vastly more powerful, essentially unkillable in any permanent sense in the material universe, and carries the full backing of Khorne behind every action. The Lion managed this in a state that was described as not fully recovered from his long sleep, with reserves of strength and capability still returning, still coming online. The implication of what a fully recovered, fully engaged Lionel Johnson represents is something the lore is clearly setting up as a major story element going forward. Section 9. The Daemon Primarchs, when they fall to chaos. 9 Primarchs turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy, and in the 10,000 years since, most of them have undergone the transformation that is in some ways the ultimate expression of Primarch power. Ascension to a Daemon Prince. A Daemon Prince is a mortal champion of chaos who has been elevated by their patron god to a state that blurs the line between mortal and divine. They retain their identity usually, and their capabilities, but those capabilities are now backed by the near-infinite power of the warp. They become partially immaterial, which makes them resistant or immune to many forms of physical harm. They become stronger, faster, more durable. Their connection to their patron chaos god deepens into something that approaches direct sharing of power. And they become, in the material universe, functionally unkillable, not because they cannot be defeated, but because defeat only banishes them back to the warp, where they eventually reform and return. This last point is crucial, and is one of the most disturbing aspects of the Daemon Primarch threat. Killing one in any conventional sense is not actually possible. What can be done is expelling them from the material universe temporarily, forcing their consciousness back into the warp. But given sufficient time, and time is something the Chaos Gods have in essentially infinite supply, they return. They always return. Mortarion, Daemon Primarch of Nurgle, illustrates this beautifully. Before his fall, Mortarion was the Primarch of the Death Guard, a legion defined by endurance, by the capacity to operate in environments that would kill anything else, by a philosophy of grinding, unstoppable resilience. He chose these traits consciously, shaped himself and his legion around them, because he had grown up on Barbarous, a toxic world where poison was the ambient condition of existence. His fall to Nurgle was not a dramatic choice in the way Angron's or Lorgar's was. It was a slow surrender. His legion was trapped in the warp during a terrible storm while traveling to Terra to join the siege, and Nurgle's power surrounded them, infecting them with the Destroyer Plague, a supernatural disease of immense lethality. For months, the Death Guard died in their ships, while Mortarion refused to ask for help, refused to surrender, refused to acknowledge that there was any force he could not endure. He had defined himself his entire life by his capacity to outlast anything. He would not break now. Until he broke, he called on Nurgle, he accepted the gift, and the plague that had been killing his sons was transformed, in an instant, into a blessing, the foundation of their new existence as plague warriors. The Death Guard were transformed. Mortarion was elevated. As a Daemon Prince of Nurgle, Mortarion is one of the most formidable beings in the setting. His endurance, already extraordinary as a mortal Primarch, has been magnified to the point where he can sustain himself in environments that would dissolve almost anything else. He pilots his own ship, a demonic vessel of immense power, and has led multiple invasions of Ultramar, Guilliman's personal domain, that required the combined effort of the Ultramarines and allied forces to repel. Perturabo, Daemon Prince of Tzientch, represents a different kind of threat. The Iron Cage, his orchestrated defeat of Rogel Dorn and the Imperial Fists in a deliberately constructed killing ground, remains one of the most discussed strategic achievements in Horus Heresy and 40K history. Perturabo was never described as the most fearsome physical combatant among his brothers, but he was, arguably, the finest siege engineer and tactical planner in the setting, and his ascension to Daemon Prince amplified not just his strength, but his already extraordinary intellectual capabilities. Lorgar, Daemon Prince of Chaos Undivided, is perhaps the most ironic case of all. He was the writer, the theologian, the one who believed in the Emperor as a god, and was crushed to be told that the Emperor was just a man. His fall was motivated by spiritual need, by the desperate human requirement to believe in something greater than oneself, and he found it in chaos, which is in some ways the most human kind of corruption. He's now the author of the faith that defines the chaos worship the Imperium fights against, the single figure most responsible for the religious dimension of the Eternal War. His power as a Daemon Prince is specifically psychic and sorcerous, fitting his nature. What the Daemon Primarchs collectively represent is a power ceiling that mortal Primarchs approach but do not match. Each one is, in the material universe, capable of feats that would be flatly impossible for their mortal selves. They are avatars of their patron gods as much as they are individuals, and they have had 10,000 years, 10 millennia, to accumulate the knowledge, the experience, the refinement of their power that comes with simply existing for that long at that level. The Loyalist Primarchs who return face Daemon Primarchs, and those are among the most brutal fights in the setting. The Lion's engagement with Angron, Guilliman's repeated confrontations with various traitor forces, Sanguinius's posthumous influence through his sons. These are not clear victories. They are, at best, costly repressions of threats that cannot be permanently resolved. The Daemon Primarchs keep coming back. Section 10. The Weaker Brothers and Why Weaker is Relative. It would be easy to spend this entire video talking about the most impressive end of the Primarch spectrum. Vulcan's immortal resilience, Magnus's psychic omnipotence, Sanguinius's terrifying speed and grace. But to give an honest picture of Primarch power, it's worth spending some time on the ones who are described in the lore as being at the lower end of the scale among their brothers. Because even the weakest Primarch is still a Primarch, and the baseline for weakest here is something that needs to be understood clearly. Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, Primarch of the Night Lords, is frequently described as the weakest Primarch in terms of raw physical strength. His fighting style relied on speed, on darkness, on psychological terror, rather than the overwhelming physical domination that Vulcan or Angron brought to a fight. He was a hunter rather than a brawler. He won through surprise, through control of the environment, through making his opponent afraid before the fighting even started. What this means in practical terms, Kurz would lose to Vulcan in a straight physical confrontation. His raw strength simply doesn't reach that level. In the same way, Magnus in a purely physical fight would be overcome by the more martially focused Primarchs if they could negate his psychic output. But weaker than Vulcan in raw strength does not mean not a Primarch. Kurz routinely killed things that no non-Primarch being could hope to deal with. He was fast enough that veteran Space Marines had genuine difficulty tracking his movements. He had a prophetic foresight darker and more fractured than Sanguinius's, but genuine that gave him information about coming threats that made him nearly impossible to ambush. He was strong enough, durable enough, and skilled enough to go toe-to-toe with beings who should have had every physical advantage over him and still win. His capture and torture of Vulcan, the physically strongest Primarch, is the perfect illustration of this. Kurz didn't beat Vulcan in a direct fight. He waited until Vulcan was already down from the catastrophe of the drop site massacre, surrounded and overwhelmed by numbers. He took advantage of circumstance, of preparation, of the control of the environment, and then he spent months demonstrating that psychological and environmental control could achieve things that direct confrontation couldn't. He couldn't kill Vulcan, no one can, permanently, but he could put him in a situation where Vulcan's physical superiority didn't matter, and that itself is a demonstration of a different kind of power. Alfarius and Omegon, the twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion, treated by the lore as effectively one entity split between two bodies, represent the opposite end of the physical spectrum from Vulcan in a different way. They were reportedly smaller than most of their brothers, to the degree that Alfarius could pass as a large but ordinary space marine in the right circumstances. Their gift was not strength but identity, the ability to disappear, to infiltrate, to be somewhere they shouldn't be, to become something they weren't. This made them extraordinarily dangerous in ways that the more obviously powerful Primarchs simply weren't. You know where Angron is. He doesn't hide. But you never know where Alfarius is. He might be the Astartes standing next to you. He might be the officer who briefed you this morning. He might be the servitor who has been in the corner of the room all week. Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, is often described as a mid-tier Primarch in terms of direct combat, capable and serious, but not in the top bracket of pure martial ability. His genius was fortification, defense, the architecture of survival under siege. He built the defenses of the Imperial Palace on Terra, which were described as the most formidable defensive works in human history. He is, in his own way, the reason the siege of Terra lasted as long as it did and ended in the way it did. In direct combat, Dorn is no weakling. He killed Alfarius in single combat, a feat that bears examination because even weaker Primarchs are still Primarchs. The death of Alfarius at Dorn's hands is one of the most significant individual combat outcomes in Horus Heresy lore, and the circumstances around it, with the mysterious question of whether it was actually Alfarius or Omegon who died, have kept that event debated in the community for years. Jagatai Khan of the White Scars represents yet another kind of strength that pure power metrics miss entirely. In terms of speed, the Khan is frequently described as the fastest of all the Primarchs, faster even than Sanguinius in some accounts, at least in terms of ground movement. He was a cavalry warrior in his heritage, shaped by the vast steppes of Chogoris, where everything survived by being faster than everything else, and his fighting style reflected that heritage at a Primarch scale. He didn't win fights by being the strongest. He won by being impossible to catch, by striking before the enemy could process that he was there, by moving in ways that made conventional defensive responses useless. His disappearance into the webway at the end of the Horus Heresy era, the White Scar's most enduring mystery, is one of the great unresolved threads of 40K lore. What the Khan found in the webway, what he's been doing there, whether he'll return in some form that the current narrative will acknowledge, these are questions the community continues to discuss with great energy. The point of all of this is that weaker among Primarchs is not a meaningful category in terms of being actually weak. It's a relative distinction within a group where the floor of capability is already so far above everything else that the difference between the weakest and strongest Primarch matters far less than the difference between any Primarch and anything below the Primarch. Tier. Section 11. The impossible question: who would win? We have spent a long time building this picture, and now comes the question that no one can fully answer, but everyone wants to try. In a true one-on-one fight, no complications, no distractions, full capability on both sides, who would win? The honest answer is that Games Workshop has deliberately made this question unanswerable, and they've done it for good reasons. The Primarchs were not designed to produce a clear hierarchy of combat ability, and in fact, the most interesting thing about the power question is how consistently the lore subverts the assumption that raw power determines outcomes. Sanguinius, arguably the finest warrior of the Primarchs, died. Magnus, the most powerful psyker, was beaten physically by Leman Russ. Horus, at the absolute peak of his chaos-empowered existence, was killed by a grievously wounded emperor, exploiting a vulnerability that a mortal man's sacrifice had created. Ferrus Manus, one of the strongest physically, died at the Dropsite massacre while surrounded by overwhelming forces. The strongest don't always win, and the lore is very careful to make sure we understand that. But we can make some observations. In terms of raw physical power, Vulcan is the consensus choice for the physically strongest mortal Primarch, with Ferrus Manus and Angron close behind. If the fight is decided by who can output the most force and absorb the most punishment through sheer biological fact, Vulcan wins most matchups. In terms of martial skill and combat effectiveness, the conversation usually involves Sanguinius, Lionel Johnson, and Leman Russ in some order. These three are the ones most consistently described in the lore as the finest warriors, the ones whose technique, speed, and battlefield intelligence make them more dangerous than their physical specs alone would suggest. Most lore scholars place Sanguinius at or near the top of this list, with the Lion a very close second and Russ completing the top three. In terms of psychic power, Magnus is not in competition with anyone else at the mortal Primarch level. He occupies a category essentially alone, the most powerful human origin psyker in the history of the setting, short of the Emperor himself. In terms of pure, tactical, and strategic intelligence, the ability to think, plan, and outmaneuver an opponent across time, rather than just in the immediate combat moment, Horus, before his fall, Guilliman, and the Lion are typically placed at the top. These are the ones who can read a fight 10 moves ahead and position themselves accordingly. Now, the complicating factor: context. In a small, contained space with no room for maneuver, speed matters less and raw power matters more. Vulcan and Angron excel here. Give the same fight a vast, open arena with room to move and the ability to control approach angles, and the equation changes. Sanguinius's aerial advantage becomes decisive. Jagatai Khan's ground speed becomes an overwhelming factor. Put the fight in darkness and confined, maze-like spaces, and Kurz's skills as a predator in environments he controls become something that even physically stronger Primarchs struggle to counter effectively. Put the fight in a location with psychic resonance near a warp rift, or on a world where the barrier between material and immaterial is thin and Magnus becomes almost unkillable, the full scope of his psychic ability amplified by the proximity to the warp's power. Strip out all chaos blessings and warp influence, put two mortal Primarchs in a clean room with matched equipment, and you're measuring something much closer to pure genetic capability. And that's where Vulcan's physical supremacy and Sanguinius's martial mastery become most directly relevant. Add chaos empowerment, the kind that was applied to Horus, the kind that turned mortal Angron into the Red Angel, and you've changed the entire problem. A chaos-backed champion is not the same entity as the Primarch who received those blessings. Horus at Ulanor was mortal. Horus at Terra was something else entirely, something that the material universe had not seen before and has not seen since. The other complicating factor is the question of what you're trying to accomplish. Pure combat ability is only one dimension of what makes a Primarch powerful. Horus's greatest strength during the heresy was not that he could beat every other Primarch in a fair fight. It was that he convinced 9 of his brothers to join him, orchestrated the greatest betrayal in human history, and came within a single act of mortal sacrifice of achieving his goal. That required intelligence, charisma, and a deep understanding of each of his brothers that no amount of raw physical power could have produced. Guillemin's power in the 41st millennium is not primarily expressed through his combat capability. It's expressed through his ability to rebuild a collapsing civilization, to inspire 1 million space marines and their support forces, to look at the shattered remnants of what the Imperium has become and still choose to try to fix it despite knowing how bad it is. That's a kind of strength that doesn't show up in combat statistics. What the lore is ultimately saying across all of these individual stories is that the Primarchs were designed to be comprehensive, not to slot into a clear power ranking, but to each represent something that the galaxy needed in a different way. Some of those things could be expressed in combat, others couldn't. And the ones that could be expressed in combat were expressed in wildly different styles that made direct comparisons inherently contextual. The honest answer to who would win is, it depends, and the dependency matters as much as the answer. But if you forced me to a single name, if you made me pick the Primarch, I would least want to fight in a fair one-on-one matchup at their personal peak, no restrictions, full capability. The name I keep coming back to is Sanguinius. The combination of speed, prophetic sense, aerial advantage, devastating physical output, and the psychic connection to something that could be called fate puts him in a category that I think even Vulcan's raw physical power would struggle to overcome. If both were operating at their absolute best, he sees what's coming. He moves faster than you can plan against it, and he hits hard enough to make it count even against the most durable beings on the planet. But this is genuinely debated, and it's supposed to be. The community has been arguing about it for decades, and Games Workshop has made sure there's enough textual support for multiple reasonable positions, which is, in its own way, part of the design. Section 12. The Scale of the Impossible, What Primarch Power Means for the 40K Setting. We've talked a great deal about what individual Primarchs can do, but I want to end by stepping back and thinking about what Primarch power means in the broader context of the setting, because I think this is where the true impact of these beings becomes most apparent. Warhammer 40,000 is a setting defined by scale. It operates in a galaxy containing hundreds of billions of stars, trillions of inhabited worlds, and populations of living beings so vast that even the losses of a single major campaign can represent numbers that exceed the total human population of the real Earth several times over. The Imperium of Man fields armies measured in the billions. The forces of chaos have been fighting for 10,000 years, and their reserves have never been exhausted. The Tyrannid swarms consume entire star systems. The Orc empires span hundreds of worlds and maintain their momentum through sheer biological fecundity. In a setting of this scale, what does a single being matter? What does one warrior, even one as extraordinary as a Primarch, actually change? The answer, remarkably, is everything. Primarchs don't just fight, they transform the battles they enter. A Primarch's presence on a battlefield changes the morale of every warrior on that field, not just their own side, but the enemy's. The enemy's morale collapses, not because they've done any calculation about force ratios, but because something deep in the wiring of living beings recognizes that a Primarch is on the field, and that recognition produces something close to despair. The actual combat impact of a single Primarch on a large engagement, say, a continent-scale battle involving millions of combatants, is physically real, measurable, and significant. A Primarch can hold a line that would otherwise break. They can break a line that would otherwise hold. They can identify and exploit weaknesses in enemy formations that no tactical display or communications network would have caught in time. They're mobile command nodes, weapons of mass destruction in single warrior form, and symbols so powerful that their presence or absence can determine the outcome of battles that their physical actions alone couldn't have decided. This is why the Horus Heresy is as devastating as it is. It's not just that the Primarchs are fighting each other, it's that each side in that conflict is losing the benefits of these incomprehensible force multipliers and gaining the horror of facing them as enemies. The difference between having a Primarch and not having one isn't just the loss of their individual combat power. It's the cascading effect that absence or presence has on everything around them. The return of Guilliman in the 41st millennium demonstrates this principle in real time. He didn't come back and immediately win a series of fights that changed the military situation of the Imperium, though he did fight, and he did win. He came back, looked at what was in front of him, and started making decisions. Those decisions triggered the Indomitus Crusade, the largest military mobilization in Imperial history since the Great Crusade itself. Worlds that had been cut off for centuries were reconnected. Chapters that had been hanging on by their fingernails were reinforced with Primaris warriors. The Imperium, which had been in a slow death spiral for a very long time, found something that it had not had for 10,000 years. Leadership from someone who actually understood, at a foundational level, what the Imperium was supposed to be. This is Primarch power, expressed not through combat, but through competence, at a scale that no ordinary being can replicate. The Daemon Primarchs express a different version of the same principle. Angron doesn't just fight, he leads the destruction of worlds. His presence galvanizes the forces of Khorne to a level of frenzied violence that even other Chaos champions can't match. His campaigns through the 38th millennium lasted 2 centuries, because wherever he went, the destruction was complete enough that there was nothing left to fight over. He burned worlds not out of strategy, but out of what he had become, and the simple fact of his existence in the material universe during those 2 centuries caused a scale of suffering that staggers comprehension. Magnus's assault on the sanctum of the Astronomicon during the 41st millennium was not a military campaign in the conventional sense. It was one being, applying his will to a psychic structure of enormous importance, and very nearly breaking the mechanism that allows the Imperium to function across interstellar space. If he had succeeded, if he had destroyed the Astronomicon, the consequences for human civilization would have been existential, not gradually terrible, immediately catastrophic. This is what it means to be a Primarch in the context of the 40K setting. Individual beings who, each in their own way, can affect outcomes that would normally require armies. The fact that they have enemies capable of engaging them, the Chaos gods who orchestrate against them, the Xenos races that field their own apex warriors, the simple arithmetic of numbers large enough to overwhelm even a Primarch, eventually, is what keeps the setting from resolving. The 40K universe is designed to be a place where the most extraordinary beings imaginable exist alongside threats large enough to challenge them. That balance is what makes it compelling. But strip away everything else, the armies, the politics, the 10,000-year narratives, and you're left with the simple fact of what a Primarch is. A being who is engineered from the genetic material of an immortal psychic demigod, woven through with the power of the warp, shaped by decades of survival in conditions that would have killed anything less. A being who stands 10 to 14 feet tall and hits with the force of a siege weapon and heals from injuries that would kill a space marine and can sense the psychic weight of the universe around them. A being who has been fighting for longer than most human civilizations have existed and has been getting better at it the entire time. How strong are Primarchs in Warhammer 40,000? Strong enough to kill a greater daemon with their bare hands. Strong enough to survive a nuclear blast. Strong enough to fight for 3 hours against an entity empowered by all 4 Chaos gods and still leave a mark that changed everything. Strong enough to hold a line that 1,000,000 soldiers could not hold. Strong enough to make gods nervous. Strong enough that strong is genuinely not a sufficient word. They are the sons of the Emperor of mankind, shaped by war and the warp and the desperate need of humanity for something that could stand between civilization and the infinite dark. They are the finest and most terrible things humanity has ever produced, the heroes and the monsters, the generals and the gods in waiting. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, they are the reason either side has any hope of winning. If you've been watching this all the way through, genuinely thank you. This is the kind of deep lore dive I love spending time on, and your engagement with it means everything. Drop a comment below. I want to know which Primarch you think would actually win that hypothetical one-on-one and why. That debate never gets old, and I read every single response. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There is so much more in this universe to explore together, and I want you there for all of it. Until next time, stay safe, and may your dice roll true. Extended section. Individual profiles. A deeper look at every Primarch's capabilities. We've spent a great deal of time on the broad strokes, the tiers, the archetypes, the defining combats that shaped our understanding of what each Primarch represents. But there's value in going through the full 20, one by one, and giving each of them their due. Because every single one of them has a story that illuminates a different aspect of what Primarch power looks like in practice. Some of them we've already covered in depth. Others deserve their own moment in focus. Think of this as the complete catalog, the full roster, with commentary on what each one brings to the table and what their story tells us about the nature of Primarch's strength. The Lion L. Johnson, Dark Angels. We've talked about the Lion at length already, but there's one dimension of his power that deserves additional attention, the sheer breadth of what he's good at. Most Primarchs have a clear domain of excellence and secondary capabilities that support it. The Lion is unusual in that his capabilities are more evenly distributed across every martial and strategic discipline than almost any of his brothers. His swordsmanship is legendary. His strategic thinking is described as among the finest of the Primarchs, rivaling Horus himself. His ability to read a battlefield not just in real time, but across the arc of an entire campaign, produced a record during the Great Crusade that was unmatched in terms of the territories brought into compliance under his direct command. The Dark Angels were the first legion, the original, and the Lion shaped them into a force that embodied a particular ideal of focused, relentless excellence. He is also deeply, almost pathologically secretive. The Lion keeps things to himself in ways that frustrated even his most loyal brothers, and this trait, which feels like a weakness in peacetime, is actually a profound tactical asset. He is very difficult to predict, even for beings who have fought alongside him for decades. His opponents frequently made the mistake of assuming they understood his strategy, because he seemed to telegraph his intentions, and then he'd do something completely different that only made sense in retrospect. His sleep in the rock after the heresy is one of the enduring mysteries of 40K. The Watchers in the Dark maintained him. His wounds healed over centuries, and he waited. Though whether this was a conscious choice or a biological necessity, no one fully knows. His return in recent lore, equipped with the Emperor's shield and the sword fealty, suggests that whatever he needed to recover from the near-mortal wound Luther gave him at Caliban's end, he has recovered from. He is, as of the current setting, one of the most powerful active Primarchs in the material universe. Fulgrim Primarch of the Emperor's Children. Fulgrim is a case that illustrates something important about the nature of Primarch power. Perfection as an ideal can be more dangerous than any weapon. Before his fall, Fulgrim was the finest swordsman among the Primarchs, or at the very least, he was in direct competition with the Lion for that title. And where the Lion expressed swordsmanship as pure technique, Fulgrim expressed it as art. He didn't just fight to win. He fought to be beautiful while winning. He cultivated his image as the exemplar of human perfection, with a dedication that went beyond vanity into something approaching obsession. His legion, the Emperor's Children, were granted the extraordinary honor of bearing the Emperor's Aquila on their armor, the symbol of imperial perfection, awarded because they more than any other exemplified what a Space Marine legion was supposed to be. This was before the fall. Before Slaanesh, the chaos god of sensation, excess, and the corruption of excellence into self-destruction, reached into Fulgrim's legion and found exactly the kind of soil in which chaos grows best. The story of Fulgrim's corruption is one of the most carefully constructed in all of Horus Heresy lore. He found a daemon sword on a Xenos world, a blade inhabited by a trapped daemon who fed on pride and ambition, and the daemon spent months carefully, incrementally working on him, playing to his desire for perfection, whispering that the Emperor's restrictions were holding him back, suggesting that true perfection required the removal of all limitations, moral, physical, or otherwise. By the time Fulgrim fought Ferrus Manus at the Dropsite Massacre, his closest brother, his dearest friend, a being he genuinely loved the daemon's work, was complete. The sword that killed Ferrus Manus was not wielded by Fulgrim alone. It was wielded by the corruption of everything he had chosen to be. As a daemon prince of Slaanesh, Fulgrim became something almost impossible to describe. His form, a serpentine being of terrifying beauty. His human torso, extending from an enormous reptilian lower body, is the physical expression of the corruption that consumed him. He moves with a grace that exceeds anything his mortal form possessed. He is faster than thought, more deadly than reason, and his presence alone exerts a psychic pressure of desire and corruption that affects anyone near him. He wounded Guilliman, nearly killed him, in fact, with a blade poisoned with the essence of chaos, and the wound required 10,000 years of stasis and eventual intervention by the Emperor's own equipment to treat. The power that Fulgrim expressed in that moment, as a fully ascended daemon prince, is a benchmark for what the corrupted Primarchs represent in terms of threat to their former brothers. Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors. Perturabo is one of the most interesting Primarchs to analyze for power, because his genius was so completely at odds with how the Great Crusade wanted him to be used that it shaped everything that followed, including his fall. He was, arguably, the finest siege engineer in the history of the Imperium. Not the best at a version of siege warfare, the best, full stop. He understood fortifications, defensive works, supply lines, attrition, and the mathematics of how to break down any prepared position with sufficient patience and precision at a level that no one else in the setting approached. His problem was that the Great Crusade kept giving him his legion as a blunt instrument rather than as the precision tool he was, where he wanted to use the Iron Warriors as an elite force that could crack any defense in the galaxy in optimal time with minimum casualties. The Imperium kept using them as the troops you sent to the grinding, miserable, casualty-heavy campaigns that no one else wanted to take. They were the ones sent to the wars that lasted decades and ended in rubble. They were the ones used to fortify Imperial positions, and then immediately redeployed to the next campaign, never staying long enough to see the results of their work. Perturabo eventually snapped, and when he snapped, it was with the thoroughness you'd expect from someone who spent his entire life thinking 10 steps ahead. His turn to chaos was not motivated by the spiritual searching that drove Lorgar, or the accumulated rage that consumed Angron, or the temptation of sensation that took Fulgrim. It was motivated by something colder and, in its own way, more relatable: exhaustion, resentment, and the conviction that he had been used and undervalued by a father who didn't understand him. His greatest tactical achievement, the Iron Cage, came after his fall, when he lured Rogel Dorn and the Imperial Fists into a killing ground of such elaborately prepared cruelty that even the knowledge that it was a trap didn't allow Dorn to avoid the catastrophic losses it inflicted. The Iron Cage demonstrated that Perturabo's genius didn't require large armies or long campaigns. Given the right preparation, he could engineer situations where his enemies destroyed themselves. As a daemon prince of Tsianch, Perturabo's mind, already extraordinary, is amplified by the god of sorcery and scheming into something that can plan across centuries and dimensions simultaneously. Jaghatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars. The Khan is the wind made flesh. This is not hyperbole, it's how the lore consistently describes him, and the metaphor is precise. He came from Chogoris, a world of vast open steppes, where the only law was speed, where survival meant being faster than everything that wanted to eat you or subjugate you, where the horse and the horseman were extensions of a single philosophy of motion. He was, by most accounts, the fastest Primarch in the setting. Not just fast in terms of raw movement speed, though his speed in ground movement was extraordinary, and some sources place his mobility as exceeding even Sanguinius's aerial velocity, but fast in the sense of decisions made, attacks launched, positions changed before the enemy could process what was happening. He fought like water, like weather, like something that couldn't be held and couldn't be predicted. The White Scars, as a legion, reflect this philosophy at every level. Their campaigns during the Great Crusade were characterized by fast, sweeping movements that encircled and disoriented enemies before delivering precise, decisive strikes that ended engagements before conventional tactics could have been fully deployed. They were not an army of position, they were an army of velocity. The Khan's personal combat capability was formidable. In the direct way, he was no slouch in a straight fight, and his swords were legendary, even by Primarch standards. But his real advantage was that he never fought the fight you had prepared for. He fought the fight that existed in the space between your preparations, the one that only became visible at the speed he was already moving. His disappearance into the webway remains one of the great unresolved threads in 40K lore. He passed through the Webway Gate with a small retinue during the aftermath of the Siege of Terra, and has not been seen since in the main setting. The Webway is, in Warhammer 40,000, an extraordinarily dangerous place, an ancient network of tunnels through the warp built by the Eldar at the height of their civilization, now partially collapsed, partially contested by daemons and Dark Eldar and Stranger Things. Whatever the Khan found there, whatever he's been doing for 10,000 years, the setting has never resolved it. Some lore hints suggest he has been fighting within the Webway this entire time, holding some critical junction or pursuing some goal, the specifics of which remain obscure. The idea of Jagatai Khan, the fastest Primarch in the setting, spending 10,000 years in a maze of tunnels, fighting things that live in the space between reality, it's one of the more quietly striking concepts in all of 40K. And it says something about what a Primarch can sustain over timescales that would break anything less. Leman Russ, Primarch of the Space Wolves. There's a debate in the 40K community about whether Leman Russ is still alive. He disappeared at the end of the Horus Heresy era, riding out into the Eye of Terror. For reasons he stated vaguely involved, seeking the Wolf Time, a prophesied final battle, and hasn't been confirmed as appearing since, though various tantalizing hints in Space Wolves lore have kept the question alive for decades. We've already talked about his combat record at some length, but there's another aspect of Russ that deserves attention: his role as the Emperor's executioner, and what that tells us about the kind of power he represented. The Emperor chose Leman Russ, above all his sons, to be the one who would deal with problems that couldn't be solved diplomatically, that required Primarch-level force applied to another Primarch-level problem. He was sent to Prospero specifically because the Emperor needed someone who would do what needed to be done there without being deflected by sentiment, by brotherhood, by the weight of respect for what Magnus had built. Russ was chosen because he was reliable in the most brutal possible sense. You told him what needed to happen, and it happened, and the exact method was his to determine. This is a Primarch who was explicitly designed for situations where other Primarchs might hesitate. The Emperor's executioner. The blade that fell when diplomacy ended. That's a specific and important role, and the fact that Russ was the one selected for it tells you something about both his capability and his temperament. His physical power is in the upper tier, not quite at Vulcan's raw output level, but close, and supplemented by an almost animalistic combat sense that made him extraordinarily dangerous in close quarters. The Spear of Russ was a weapon of specific significance, carrying something of the Emperor's own power in its construction, and Russ's use of it to wound Horus, an actually remarkable achievement, demonstrated that even the most chaos-empowered being in the setting was not fully beyond his reach. Whether the Wolf Time has begun, whether Russ will return, what the Space Wolves believe his return will mean, these are questions that Games Workshop continues to tease without resolving, and probably will for years to come. The possibility of a returned Leman Russ fighting in the current setting is one of the most anticipated potential narrative developments in the community. Rogel Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists. Rogel Dorn is not typically ranked among the top-tier combat Primarchs, and he himself would probably not claim that position. His genius was elsewhere, in the architecture of defense, in understanding how to make a position impregnable, in the mathematics of what it took to hold something against forces brand that shouldn't be holdable against. The Imperial Palace on Terra, the seat of the Emperor's power, the greatest fortification in human history, was built by Dorn. He spent years designing and constructing its defenses, incorporating every piece of military engineering knowledge he possessed, anticipating threats that wouldn't exist for decades, and building countermeasures into the structure that the defenders didn't understand the purpose of until the day those threats actually arrived. This is what Primarch intelligence looks like in a non-combat context, the ability to project the future accurately enough to build for it. During the Siege of Terra itself, Dorn's strategic management of the defense is one of the great examples of Primarch capability applied to a grinding, attritional fight rather than a dynamic campaign. He had no advantages to exploit. He was surrounded, outgunned in the air, and fighting with a diminishing garrison against enemy numbers that grew rather than shrank. He held Terra not through any individual act of heroism, but through the precise management of resources, the prioritization of losses, and the willingness to make decisions that sacrificed positions in order to preserve the core. He survived the entire siege. He held the Eternity Gate, He watched Sanguinius die and the Emperor fall, and still managed the end of the battle with the presence of mind to ensure that what needed to be saved was saved. In combat, Dorn is serious and formidable, more than capable against most threats, genuinely dangerous even by Primarch standards. His kill of Alfarius is a significant data point that doesn't get discussed as much as it should, because Alfarius was himself a Primarch, and the fight between them was real. The circumstances around whether it was actually Alfarius or Omegon who died at fall have kept the community debating this for years, but the lore clearly states that Rogal Dorn fought and killed one of the Primarchs of the Alpha Legion in single combat. That's a serious combat record regardless of who you're debating about. Conrad Kurza, the Night Haunter, Night Lords. We've already discussed Kurza's position as one of the physically weaker Primarchs, but his story deserves more attention because it illustrates something profound about the relationship between power and purpose. Kurz was given the prophetic ability to see the future, a gift that, in his case, was more curse than blessing. His visions were not the clear, actionable foresight that Sanguinius occasionally accessed. They were dark, overwhelming, often ambiguous predictions of violence and death that began when he was still a child on the nightmare world of Nostromo and never left him. He saw the deaths of billions. He saw the corruption of his legion. He saw his own death at the hands of an assassin named Mashin, a Calidus assassin sent by the Emperor, and he chose, in the end, to let it happen. This is the key to understanding Kurz. His fall was philosophical as much as it was personal. He had a genuine, serious argument about the nature of justice, about whether fear was a legitimate instrument of order, about whether the end justified the means when the alternative was suffering on a massive scale. His methods were monstrous, but he genuinely believed, and made a coherent case, that the terror he inflicted prevented greater suffering in the long run. He was wrong in the way his execution was handled, but the argument itself was not entirely incoherent, and the Emperor's response to it was inadequate, which is part of why Kurz became what he became. He allowed Mshen to kill him, not because he had given up, but because he believed his death at an assassin's hands would prove his point that the Emperor was a hypocrite who used violence and fear while forbidding others from using the same tools. It was, in its own way, the most sophisticated thing any of the Primarchs did at the moment of their death. He choreographed it. He turned his murder into an argument. In terms of raw capability, Kurz was fast, almost shockingly fast for his physical build. He operated best in darkness, in confined spaces, against unprepared opponents. His claws, long, retractable, and extraordinarily sharp, were his primary weapons, and he wielded them with a speed that made his attacks very difficult to defend against, even for other Primarchs. He was, at his core, a predator, and the predator's toolkit, patience, control of environment, the ability to strike before his prey recognized the threat was more refined in him than in any other Primarch. Sanguinius, the Great Angel, extended consideration. We talked extensively about Sanguinius earlier, but I want to return to one aspect of his story that I think is underappreciated: the weight of what he knew and chose to carry. Sanguinius was burdened with foreknowledge of his own death for an extended period before the Siege of Terra. He didn't know every detail. Prophetic vision in 40K lore is rarely that specific, but he knew the broad strokes. He knew he would die at Horus's hands. He knew the Siege of Terra would be the last thing he did. He went anyway. This is not bravery in the uncomplicated sense that a soldier charging a machine gun nest is brave. It's something more complicated and, in its way, more impressive. Sanguinius had the ability to see the future. He chose, with full awareness of what that future contained, to walk toward it anyway, because he understood that the alternative, not being there, not fighting, not forcing that crack in Horus's armor that gave the Emperor the vulnerability he needed, would be worse. He was carrying the weight of 10,000 years of his son's future in that decision. He knew what the Blood Angels would become after his death: the Red Thirst, the Black Rage, the terrible inheritance of his final moments, psychically branded into every son he'd ever have. He knew they would suffer. He chose the path anyway, because the suffering his sons would carry was survivable, and the world where he didn't make that choice might not be. This is, in my reading of the lore, the single most powerful thing any Primarch ever did. Not the physical feat of cracking chaos-enhanced armor, not the psychic achievement of fighting through foreknowledge of doom, The sheer, sustained act of will it took to walk forward into a death you've seen in advance, carrying it calmly, even gently, because you understand what it's for. Sanguinius spent his last days as a comfort and an inspiration to everyone around him, even knowing what was coming. That's not weakness. That's a kind of strength that doesn't show up on any power-scaling chart. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands. Ferrus Manus is, in some respects, the great unfulfilled potential of the Primarch roster. He died early at the dropsite massacre of Istvan V, during the very first major act of the Horus Heresy, and what he might have become had the heresy unfolded differently is one of the persistent what-if questions of the setting. His living metal arms are the physical expression of a broader aspect of his character, an attraction to the merger of flesh and machine that his sons, the Iron Hands, have taken to an extreme that he himself might not have fully endorsed. The Iron Hands in the 41st millennium are a chapter defined by the belief that the flesh is weak and must be replaced with iron, a philosophy directly tied to their grief over the loss of their Primarch and the trauma of watching him die. In terms of direct combat, Ferrus Manus was near the top of the physical power scale. His forge work, the ability to shape metal with his own hands, unaided by tools, meant that the weapons and armor he made for himself were uniquely optimized for his own capabilities, in ways that manufactured equipment never could be. The Forgebreaker hammer, which passed to Perturabo after Ferrus's death and became a core part of his arsenal, was one of the finest weapons ever produced by Primarch hands. His death at Fulgrim's hands during the Dropsite massacre is treated by the lore as one of the defining tragedies of the Horus Heresy, not because Ferrus was weak, but because of who killed him, how, and what it did to both parties. Fulgrim had been his closest friend among the Primarchs. The daemon inhabiting the blade that killed Ferrus did so through Fulgrim's hands, exploiting a bond of trust that had been weaponized against them both. The Iron Hands carry their grief over Ferrus Manus as something that has shaped their entire identity for 10,000 years. They cut away their flesh as penance. They distrust emotion as a source of weakness. They have become, in some ways, a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of a legion losing its Primarch too soon, before he had time to truly shape what they would be. Angron extended profile. Angron's tragedy is so fundamental to his power that separating them is essentially impossible. Everything he can do is inseparable from everything that was done to him. The butcher's nails, those crude, brutal cortical implants that rewired his neurological reward response to make violence feel like relief, were not something Angron chose. They were a slave owner's modification, designed to make him more effective as a gladiator and more tractable as property. They worked, in the sense that they made him a more fearsome fighter. They also slowly destroyed the higher cognitive functions that made complex thought and emotional connection possible, replacing them with a constant, escalating need for violence that only battle could temporarily satisfy. What Angron was before the nails is one of the most painful what-if questions in Primarch lore. He was, by accounts, capable of extraordinary things before the surgical corruption began to do its work. He loved his fellow slaves. He fought for them. He was willing to die for them and chose to make that final stand alongside them when the Emperor found him. The Emperor took him away. And Angron never entirely forgave that, because the Emperor saved him from a death that would have meant something and gave him a life that felt like a different kind of slavery. By the time of the Horus Heresy, the nails had been accelerating their damage for decades under the increased demands of constant war. Angron was dying. Lorgar knew this, and his transformation of Angron into a Daemon Prince of Khorne was, from Lorgar's perspective, an act of mercy saving Angron's life by giving him to a god who could sustain him in a way his damaged body could not. Angron did not experience it as mercy. He experienced it as the final loss of everything that had been him before the gladiatorial pits, before the nails, before the Emperor's summoning. What was elevated to daemonhood was the rage and the violence and the hunger for blood, amplified and crystallized. Angron, the man, whatever remained of him by that point, was consumed in the process. The Daemon Prince that resulted is, by some measures, the most purely physically destructive being in the current 40K setting. He cannot be killed in any permanent sense. He regenerates from wounds with unnatural speed. His strength exceeds the mortal Angron by a margin that is difficult to quantify, but clearly expressed in his combat record. He has engaged and driven back forces that would have challenged entire armies. The Lion's encounter with Angron in the Arcs of Omen narrative is the most recent major direct confrontation in the lore between a loyalist Primarch and a Daemon Primarch, and its outcome. The Lion driving Angron from the field is a significant statement about where the power balance currently sits in the returning Primarch storyline. Magnus the Red extended profile. Magnus deserves additional time beyond what we covered earlier, specifically around the tragedy of his intelligence being used against him. He was, from birth, a being of exceptional cognitive power. His psychic gifts allowed him to perceive in dimensions that no other Primarch could access. He could see the causal chains that connected present events to future outcomes, could track the signatures of other psychic beings across interstellar distances, could perceive the intentions of those around him with a clarity that made deception very difficult to maintain in his presence. And yet, he was deceived, thoroughly, repeatedly. Tzeentch used Magnus's greatest strength against him, his absolute certainty that he could see what was happening and respond to it correctly. The god of change and scheming is, in essence, the embodiment of plans within plans, of multiple-layered deceptions, where what appears to be manipulation is itself being manipulated. Magnus believed he understood the board. He believed he could see all the pieces. He was wrong, and his confidence in his own insight made him more vulnerable to the deception rather than less. This is the most important thing to understand about Magnus the Red. His story is a warning about the limits of psychic power, about the danger of believing that superior perception and intelligence automatically confer superior wisdom. He was smarter than almost everyone around him. He was still outmaneuvered. The destruction of his legion, the sons he genuinely loved, the scholars and warriors he had spent decades cultivating into the finest psychers in the Imperium, happened because Magnus was too confident that he knew what he was doing with the warp. He thought he could use the Chaos God's own tools against them. He was wrong. They were using him the entire time. As a Daemon Prince, he has had 10,000 years to sit with this knowledge. The lore suggests he is not entirely at peace with it. He serves Tzeentch. He does what the Architect of Fate requires. But there are hints throughout the lore of a Magnus who still hasn't forgiven himself for what happened to the 1,000 Sons, who still carries the weight of every son who burned on Prospero, and who channels some portion of that guilt and rage into his ongoing war against the Imperium. Because if the Imperium is the thing that burned his sons, then destroying the Imperium is at least a kind of justice, however incomplete and compromised. Horus Lupercal, the complete picture. There's one more thing to say about Horus that gets less attention than his combat record. The intelligence behind everything. Horus was not just strong, he was not just charismatic. He was the Primarch who most completely understood how the other Primarchs worked. He knew which buttons to push for each of his brothers. He knew how to speak to Angron's rage, to Lorgar's spiritual hunger, to Fulgrim's perfectionism, to Perturabo's resentment. He knew which of his brothers could be turned and which couldn't, and he made sure that the ones who couldn't be turned were out of position when the hammer fell. The planning that went into the Horus heresy, the drop site massacre, the corruption of the 4 legions before the betrayal became public, the luring of loyalist forces away from Terra, the timing of everything to maximize the initial shock and prevent any coordinated response, represents the most sophisticated strategic plan in the history of the setting. It very nearly worked. The fact that it failed was not because of any flaw in its conception, but because of one factor Horus could not fully account for: the human capacity for sacrifice, in the form of Sanguinius's choice to face him and Ollanius Pius's choice to step between him and the Emperor. The Chaos Gods backed Horus because he was already the finest of all the Primarchs in the ways that matter at scale. They amplified what was already there. And what was already there was a being who combined extraordinary physical power with extraordinary strategic intelligence in a package that the rest of his brothers, individually or even collectively, could not match without. The one element that ultimately defeated him: the willingness to die for something beyond victory. Mortarion extended profile. Mortarion is defined by refusal. His entire story is about a being who refused to bend, refused to accept help, refused to acknowledge that there were conditions he could not outlast through sheer stubbornness, and who was eventually broken by the one condition that outlasted even him. His homeworld of Barbaros was a world of poison. The upper atmosphere was so thick with toxic fog that no unaugmented human could breathe in the higher altitudes, and the beings that lived up there, necromancer warlords and their mutant servants, used this as a weapon of control. The human population of Barbaros lived below the fog line, sheltered in the lower valleys, while their overlords were literally above them in an environment the humans couldn't survive. Mortarion grew up learning that poison was the ambient condition of existence. He trained himself to tolerate toxins that would kill anything normal, developed a philosophy based on endurance as the supreme virtue, and eventually raised an army that destroyed the necromancer warlords one by one until the last one, his own adoptive father, retreated to the highest peak of Barbaros, where even Mortarion couldn't breathe. The Emperor arrived, solved the problem casually from a position of resources Mortarion didn't have, and Mortarion hated him for it, because it made his lifetime of refusal and endurance feel somehow insufficient. As a mortal Primarch, Mortarion's combat style was built around that same philosophy of outlasting. He wore down his opponents. He didn't move fast or strike with spectacular force, but he absorbed punishment and kept coming, and eventually most things that fought him were unable to maintain the fight as long as he could. He carried a massive scythe called Silence, which was itself a weapon of slow, grinding devastation, not a thing you blocked once and moved on from, but a thing that found openings through attrition. The destroyer plague that trapped his legion in the warp ultimately broke his refusal. He could not outlast it. His sons were dying, and no amount of personal endurance could change that. He accepted Nurgle's gift, and the plague became a blessing, and Mortarion became something that now cannot be outlasted by almost anything. As a daemon prince of Nurgle, Mortarion is perhaps the most genuinely difficult to deal with in the long run. His power isn't the most spectacular. He doesn't produce the world-altering psychic events that Magnus generates, or the pure kinetic terror that Angron carries. But he is effectively impossible to kill in any permanent sense. His resilience is a function of both his Primarch nature and his Nurgle ascension, amplifying each other, and he has been prosecuting campaigns against the Imperium with methodical patience for 10,000 years. The War of the Plague in Ultramar, during which Mortarion invaded Guilliman's personal domain with an army of Nurgle daemons and Deathguard warriors, remains one of the most significant conflicts in recent 40K. Narrative. It ended with Guilliman rallying sufficient force to drive Mortarion back, but not with any decisive victory. Mortarion went back to the warp. He continues his plans. He always continues his plans. Lorgar Primarch of the Word-Bearers. Lorgar Aurelian is despised in the Imperium, and has been, throughout the lore's history, one of the most disliked figures in the fandom as well, for reasons that are worth examining. He was the least martially focused of the Primarchs, described as a priest as much as a general, a theologian who approached everything through the lens of faith and devotion. His legion, the Word-Bearers, were repeatedly rebuked by the Emperor for spending too much time building temples and shrines to their conquests, rather than moving on efficiently to the next campaign. The Emperor found them too slow, too focused on the wrong things, too interested in worship that the Imperium's secular philosophy had explicitly rejected. When the Emperor personally destroyed the cathedral world of Monarchia, a world that the Word-Bearers had spent decades building as a monument to the Emperor's greatness, and made Lorgar and his legion kneel in the peace, ruins, it broke something in Lorgar, not his faith, just the specific object of it. He had always needed to believe in something greater than himself. He simply redirected that need to something that accepted his devotion, and the Chaos Gods were extremely willing to do so. Lorgar's fall is the most directly causal in the heresy more than any other Primarch. His decisions set the events in motion. He found chaos first. He converted Horus. He orchestrated the conversion of the other turncoat Primarchs. Without Lorgar, there may well have been no Horus heresy. In terms of raw power, Lorgar is interesting, because his development as a psyker over the course of the heresy was substantial. He started as someone with significant psychic gifts that were mostly devoted to theological study and communication. He ended the heresy as one of the most dangerous sorcerers in the setting, having spent years deep in the warp, learning everything the ruinous powers were willing to teach him. As a daemon prince of chaos, undivided unusual among the daemon Primarchs, most of whom serve a specific patron, he represents the combined psychic legacy of all four chaos gods, rather than the specialized power of any single one. Alpharius and Omegon, the last legion. The twin Primarchs of the Alpha Legion deserve their own consideration, because they represent a style of power that is completely unlike any of their brothers, and, arguably, the one that has aged best in the current setting. Alpharius and Omegon were the last Primarchs discovered during the Great Crusade. They were smaller than their brothers, closer to the stature of a large Astartes than to the towering presence most Primarchs projected. And they had divided their existence between them in a way that the Imperium never fully understood. They shared command of the Alpha Legion, using the fiction that they were a single Primarch, trading places, maintaining deceptions across years and campaigns, to the degree that even the Legion's highest command structure didn't always know which one of them was speaking. Their power was deception. Their gifts were identity, mimicry, infiltration, the ability to be other things, to be in places they shouldn't be, to arrange for outcomes through mechanisms so indirect that the connection between cause and effect was invisible to everyone involved. The Alpha Legion during the Great Crusade was the Imperium's most effective intelligence and black operations force. They didn't just fight wars. They ended threats before they became wars, through targeted subversion, through infiltration of enemy command structures, through assets placed years in advance whose existence no one suspected. One of the most famous and enduring mysteries of 40K lore is the exact nature of the Alpha Legion's loyalties. The Horus Heresy novel Alpharius, head of the Gorgon and the original Alpha Legion books, have created a situation where it is genuinely unclear whether the Alpha Legion serving chaos was itself a deception, a double game played with the chaos gods themselves, achieve an outcome that would have protected humanity. The lore supports multiple readings, and Games Workshop has, characteristically, maintained deliberate ambiguity on the topic. Omegon, if he survived the death of Alpharius at Dorn's hands, is confirmed, but whether it was Alpharius or Omegon remains contested, may still be operating somewhere in the setting, pursuing objectives that no one outside the Alpha Legion's innermost circle fully understands. In terms of physical combat, neither of the twins was at the absolute top of the Primarch scale, but the assassination of a Primarch through surgical strike, Alpharius killing the Primarch Omegon? Wait, that's confused. The point stands. Direct physical supremacy was never the point of the twin Primarchs. Their power was systemic, long-term, and designed to operate at scales and timelines that most of their brothers never thought about. Corax Primarch of the Raven Guard. Corvus Corax, the Raven Lord, is one of the most quietly tragic Primarchs in the roster. He survived the dropsite massacre of Istvan V barely, and at enormous cost, and spent the remainder of the Horus Heresy trying to rebuild a legion that had been all but destroyed. His homeworld of Deliverance, formerly the prison moon of Lycaeus, shaped him in ways that distinguished him sharply from most of his brothers. He grew up among slaves and miners who were systematically brutalizing by their overseers, and he spent his formative years not building an empire or surviving a death world, but organizing a resistance movement. He was a revolutionary before he was a warlord, and that experience gave him a perspective on the relationship between power and the people who wielded it that few of his brothers shared. In terms of combat capability, Corax specialized in what might be called the elimination of concentrations of power. He wasn't the Primarch you sent when you needed a wall held. He was the Primarch you sent when you needed the enemy's commander dead, their supply lines cut, their communications disrupted, and their morale collapsed before they fully understood what was happening. He could move through heavily defended positions while leaving almost no trace. He could coordinate surgical strikes across large areas using minimal forces. After the Dropsite massacre, during which the Salamanders and Raven Guard took catastrophic losses from the traitor ambush Corax received from the Emperor, a modified version of the gene seed enhancement process, hoping to rebuild his legion quickly. The process was corrupted by Alpha Legion interference, producing monsters rather than Astartes. Corax destroyed what he'd created, haunted by what he'd done in desperation. He eventually departed into the void on a solitary quest, leaving a note promising to return when the war against chaos could be won. Whether he has returned, or in what form, the lore is deliberately vague. Vulcan Extended Profile. We covered Vulcan's physical power and his perpetual nature extensively earlier, but there's another dimension of him that deserves consideration: his role as the most compassionate of all the Primarchs, and how that compassion functioned as a kind of strength in itself. Most Primarchs cared about humanity in the abstract, in the way that generals care about their armies, with the kind of professional concern that is fundamentally strategic rather than personal. Vulcan cared about ordinary human beings specifically. He would stop campaigns to repair a village that had been damaged by collateral fire from his own legion's operations. He learned the crafts of his adopted homeworld's artisans and worked alongside them. He remembered the names of ordinary Salamander's soldiers who had died years before, in campaigns that anyone else would have filed away under acceptable losses. This isn't a power in the conventional sense, but it's not irrelevant either. It shaped the Salamanders into the most humane of all the Space Marine legions, the ones most likely to protect civilians at personal risk, the ones whose combat doctrine specifically included provisions for non-combatant welfare that other legions didn't bother with. In a setting defined by callousness and industrial-scale brutality, the Salamanders are an exception, and they're an exception because of the values their Primarch modeled for them. Vulcan's perpetual nature also raises questions about where he is in the current setting. He disappeared after the Horus Heresy, leaving behind a series of artifacts called the 9 Artifacts of Vulcan as a kind of challenge quest for his sons to prove themselves. Some of these artifacts have been recovered. His current whereabouts are officially unknown, but his immortal nature means that, wherever he is almost certainly not dead. The weapons of the Primarch's instruments made for their masters. One last aspect of Primarch power that deserves discussion: the weapons they carry. A Primarch going into battle without a weapon is still one of the most dangerous things in the setting, but a Primarch carrying one of the weapons crafted specifically for their use adds another layer of capability that is genuinely significant. These weapons were not mass-produced. They were made in limited quantities by the finest craftspeople in the Imperium, or, in many cases, by the Primarchs themselves. Ferrus Manus, with his forgeable living metal hands, created the Forgebreaker hammer that is now one of Perturabo's signature weapons. Vulcan crafted weapons of flame and void that the Salamander's armories still preserve with religious care. The lion wields now the Emperor's shield and the sword fealty, artifacts of immense power that were prepared specifically for his return. Sanguinius carried the Spear of Telesto, a weapon described in some sources as carrying the Emperor's own psychic power within it, a blessed instrument capable of directly harming demonic entities that conventional weapons couldn't touch. The armor he wore, the armor of Aegis, was similarly exceptional, its protection incorporating psychic wards that made it one of the most resilient pieces of personal protection in the setting. Horus's weapons, the World Breaker, Mace, and the Talon of Horus were instruments that combined devastating physical capability with chaos-empowered properties that made them function differently against certain opponents than conventional weapons would. The Talon of Horus became, after the heresy, one of the most symbolic weapons in Chaos Space Marine culture. Abaddon the Despoiler carries it now, as the most visible symbol of his claim to Horus's legacy. The point is that Primarchs fighting with their signature weapons are not just using equipment. They're using tools that were made for them specifically, that interact with their capabilities in ways that standard weapons don't, and that carry histories and significance that themselves have effects on the psychic weight of the battles they fight in. Final thoughts: what the Primarchs tell us about Warhammer 40,000. The question we started with, just how strong are Primarchs, has taken us through a lot of territory. Through the biology of their creation, the hierarchy of power they occupy, the specific capabilities of each of the 20 brothers, the way those capabilities changed when chaos touched them, and the way the most powerful ones bent the arc of 10,000 years of history simply through the fact of their existence. But I think the deepest answer to the question isn't really about power levels at all. The Primarchs are strong enough to matter. They're strong enough that their individual choices to turn traitor or stay loyal, to sacrifice themselves or preserve themselves, to be what they were made to be, or find something else, had consequences that shaped the entire history of humanity in the 40K universe. And they were strong enough that even after 10,000 years, the Primarchs who survived continue to matter, continue to be forces that the galaxy has to reckon with. But they are also, very deliberately, not strong enough to simply solve everything. The Emperor is gone, the galaxy is broken. The forces of chaos have had 10 millennia to entrench themselves. The Tyranids are coming from outside the galaxy. The Orc empires cover vast territories. The Eldar are dying. Everything is, in the traditional Warhammer 40K phrase, grimdark. Returned Primarchs like Guillemon and the Lion are not salvation. They are, at best, the factor that keeps certain losses from becoming total. They can hold lines that would otherwise break. They can inspire forces that would otherwise lose heart. They can personally address threats that would otherwise require armies. But they cannot fix the fundamental structural problems that have accumulated over 10,000 years of history. They are extraordinary. They are not sufficient. And that tension, the tension between beings who are genuinely superhuman in every meaningful sense and a universe so broken that even superhuman isn't enough, is what makes Warhammer 40,000 compelling. As a setting, the Primarchs are the most powerful warriors humanity has ever produced, and they are fighting a war that was never designed to be won cleanly, in a galaxy that has forgotten what winning would even look like. They persist anyway, because they are what they are, and because persistence is, in the end, the only option on offer. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But there are also Primarchs fighting it. And that, I think, is both the tragedy and the hope of the setting in a single thought. Thank you for spending this time with me. This has been one of the most comprehensive deep dives I've had the chance to put together, and I hope it gave you something new to think about regarding these extraordinary beings. Drop a comment letting me know which section hit hardest for you, which Primarch you think is the most underrated in terms of power, and where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely read every comment, and the conversations in the comments section of videos like this one are some of the best discussions in the community. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. There is so much more in this universe to explore together, and I want you there for every single piece of it. Until next time.